Hey y'all, it's entry number 92 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Tyler Lockett, wide receiver, Seattle Seahawks. We'll start with the positives with Tyler Lockett's fantasy profile. Fantasy production the last 3 years. Tyler Lockett has been a low-end WR1, high-end WR2 in each of the last 3 seasons. In 2019, Tyler Lockett finished as the WR15 in standard, with 153.2 total fantasy points and 9.6 fantasy points per game. The WR14 in half PPR formats with 194.2 total fantasy points and 12.1 fantasy points per game, and the WR13 in full PPR formats with 235.2 total fantasy points and 14.7 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In 2020, Tyler Lockett finished as the WR11 in standard with 165.4 total fantasy points and 10.3 fantasy points per game, the WR9 in half PPR formats with 215.4 total fantasy points and 13.5 fantasy points per game, and the WR8 in full PPR formats with 265.4 total fantasy points and 16.6 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2021 season, Tyler Lockett finished as the WR11 in standard with 168.4 total fantasy points and 10.5 fantasy points per game, the WR13 in half PPR formats with 204.9 total fantasy points and 12.8 fantasy points per game, and the WR16 in full PPR formats with 241.4 total fantasy points and 15.1 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Finishing as a top 16 wideout in all formats in each of the last 3 seasons makes it easier to see how Lockett could be a good fantasy asset in 2022. The next thing I really like about Tyler Lockett's fantasy profile is his durability. Tyler Lockett has missed just 2 games in his entire 7-year career thus far, playing in 111 of a possible 113 regular season games, or 98.23% over the course of his career. Availability is an important ability, and Lockett is consistently available to play games. The last major thing I really like about Tyler Lockett's fantasy profile is his efficiency. Lockett was very efficient last year, finishing top 12 among wide receivers in yards per route run with 2.58, 9th best among wide receivers. Yards per target, 11.0, 4th best among wide receivers. Yards per reception with 16.1, the 6th best among wide receivers. Yards per passing attempt with 2.37, the 6th best among wide receivers. Fantasy points per route run with 0.53, the 11th best among wide receivers, and fantasy points per target with 2.26, the 9th best among wide receivers according to Player Profiler. Moving on to some of the concerns with Tyler Lockett's fantasy profile. Major QB downgrade. It cannot be understated the difference between Russell Wilson throwing Tyler Lockett the ball and Geno Smith or Drew Lock throwing Lockett the ball for a full season. In the 4 games that Geno Smith played last year, he played more of a game manager role, throwing 5 touchdowns to 1 interception, but only having 702 passing yards or 175.5 per game according to Pro Football Reference. He also averaged just 185.7 passing yards per game and threw just 25 touchdowns to 34 interceptions in his 2 years as the Jets starting quarterback in 2013 and 2014. The other option they have as a starting quarterback right now is Drew Lock, who hasn't been much better. With Seattle likely having the worst quarterback room in the NFL this year, Lockett's fantasy potential is going to be lower than some other players going around his draft range. The next concern I have with Tyler Lockett's fantasy profile is that he has a lot of feast or famine weeks. Tyler Lockett hasn't been the most consistent wide receiver on a week-to-week basis over the course of his career. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Lockett had 5 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 1 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 16 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. It was the same thing in 2020, as a majority of his production came in 3 weeks. Week 3 of the 2020 season against the Dallas Cowboys, where he caught 9 passes on 13 targets for 100 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. Week 7 of the 2020 season against the Arizona Cardinals, where he caught 15 passes on 20 targets for 200 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. And Week 17 of the 2020 season against San Francisco, where he caught 12 passes on 14 targets for 90 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Clearly, on a week-to-week basis, he's not the most consistent receiver. The last major concern I have with Tyler Lockett's fantasy profile is that he's not great in the yards after the catch department. In 2021, Tyler Lockett was just one of 6 receivers to have over 1,000 receiving yards that didn't crack the top 50 in the yards after the catch category, ranking 71st in the NFL with 277 yards after the catch. The other players who didn't crack the top 50 were Stephon Diggs, Terry McLaurin, Kyle Pitts, T. Higgins, and Mike Evans. Some additional thoughts on Tyler Lockett's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, the Seattle Seahawks wide receiver room averaged 11.24 receptions on 18.18 targets for 153.59 receiving yards and 1.47 receiving touchdowns per game. Personal opinion: Tyler Lockett is currently going off of the board as WR36, about pick 96 overall on ESPN, and WR40, about pick 111 overall on Yahoo. Will he finish better than his ADP? Yeah, probably. But will he move the needle for your fantasy team at all in 2022? Probably not, with Drew Lock or Geno Smith throwing him the ball. He's a flex play this year with not a lot of upside in this offense, and I would personally prefer to take a shot on someone who has a better shot of being a major impact player. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Tyler Lockett has shown support for the Light It Up Foundation. The Light It Up Foundation works with communities, schools, and organizations to introduce mindfulness, meditation, and movement with a yoga focus, first and foremost to children. The foundation also serves to educate first responder, police and doctors, veterans, and people who suffer mental disorders. We help others learn how to nurture and care for themselves and their bodies by meeting them where they are and introducing new possibilities as per their website. Here's a link to this organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.